So hello there guys and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast. I hope you're well. F1 has returned from a long summer break, and despite all of the narratives and all of the stories that we got in the opening half of the season, we were expecting plenty more newer ones to start taking shape in the second half of this season. As it stood, despite the long break, the many questions on performance following this new technical directive, how would it change the pecking order? Would it bring Ferrari and Red Bull back into the clutches of the likes of Mercedes, perhaps Alpine and McLaren as well? Instead of all that, we ended up with arguably the most dominant and formidable performance that we got this season from the world champion Max Verstappen and Red Bull, despite the fact that he started in P14, very quickly overcoming the competition to win the Belgian Grand Prix in incredible fashion, which is certainly going to leave a lot of their rivals scratching their heads thinking what they can do to try and stop this newfound Red Bull dominance. But joining me on this episode of the podcast to go through the main talking points of the race and some of the new narratives being formed in the second half of the season is my co-host Courtney Pine for this episode. Courtney, first of all, how are you doing, and how could you sum up the Belgian Grand Prix?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm doing well. Nice, relaxing weekend. But yeah, I'm going to return your question with another question. Which Grand Prix did you find more entertaining? This Belgian Grand Prix or last year's Belgian Grand Prix?
Well, I mean, by default, this one has to be much more entertaining by proxy of the fact that we actually got a Grand Prix this time around. I mean, I totally get it. I know what you're trying to get at here, Courtney, and I understand why some people might feel that this race was boring. And I think, granted, F1 pays a lot of attention, and its main attraction is the race that goes on at the front of the grid. And by and large, that race was pretty much won at the point where Max Verstappen managed to overtake his teammate and take the lead of the race after the first round of pit stops. I mean, it's crazy to think that Max managed to get from P14 all the way into, or P15 actually, to P1 in 15 laps. I mean, of course, we're not counting Yuki Tsunoda because he had to start from the pit lane, but I'm pretty sure Max would have got him anyway at some point early on in the race. But you just have to stand there and acknowledge how brilliant that performance was. I mean, if we fast forward, or reverse it actually, if we take ourselves back a few years, back 2020, when Lewis Hamilton was doing similar things. I'm not sure if he came back from that far back in the grid in 2020. I mean, of course, the obvious one that we saw was Brazil. And, you know, for all arguments purposes, as brilliant as a driver as Max's was today, Lewis's was obviously phenomenal at Brazil. And of course, we can't compare because there were certain scenarios were different, even though they had to recover from a lesser position to get the win at the end of it. But there were still great drives in their own merit. But I totally get it. Where some people may feel a little bit disheartened by how easy it was for him in the end. And ultimately, you just got to put that down to the competition, really. Max and Red Bull, and even Sergio Perez, were in a completely different league to everybody else this weekend. So, you know, and of course, we can't compare it to last season because that wasn't a race at all. I don't care what anybody says, that was not a race. It was an absolute shambles. But the good news, of course, we can take from that is that we actually got a pretty decent race out of the end of it by comparison. And there weren't really any sort of not really any proper complications with the weather. It was a bone dry race for once at Belgium.
Yeah, it was a complete contrast. But yeah, no, I do feel a bit flat about the race result because I think this season so far has been fantastic. Not going to take anything away from what's happened so far. And, you know, there's been a talk about the technical directive that, you know, we've discussed before coming on. And I'm just disappointed with how it's gone for Ferrari. I know we spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about Ferrari, but Ferrari were like the main hope of like giving us a proper title race throughout the season. And just, you know, we've spoken many a time about Ferrari struggles before the summer break, but God, have they fallen back? Is it, you know, is it because of the technical directive? Is it because Ferrari got the setup wrong? I suppose we're going to find that in the next couple of races. But I'll be honest, the race today took me back to Spa 2013, where, you know, it looked like Ferrari in the first half of the 2013 season, looked like Ferrari and maybe Mercedes could challenge Red Bull and Vettel at this stage. We go to Spa in 2013. Vettel blows the competition away, and then he goes on to win, I think, 8 races, wasn't it, for the rest of the season after
Yeah.
that point?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
And it feels very reminiscent of that. And there'll be Max Verstappen fans possibly watching or in the comments saying, "Oh, he's just been salty." Da 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 da. At the end of the day, if your favourite driver isn't winning races, you at least want to see some entertainment. And I don't know. I hope I'm wrong, but I just got a feeling we might see a repeat of 2013 for the rest of the season. Let's hope that we're wrong.
Yeah, I can agree with that because looking at how impressive Max Verstappen and Red Bull were this weekend, and you can tell how impressive they were by the fact that Sergio Perez would have been equally dominant this weekend, the way the race played out, if Max was struggling to get through the field. It was Sergio's to lose after that second stint, the way that they just overhauled Carlos Sainz and completely left him in a different race of his own, where the point was he was fighting George Russell and to a degree his teammate, or at least he would have been if his teammate wasn't compromised in the race anyway. But it just goes to show how great of a job that they've done at Red Bull. And nobody wants to see anybody win 9 races in a row without any sort of context. I mean, if Max Verstappen was trying to overhaul Charles Leclerc's championship lead, as at this point in the season he probably would have had without all the strategy issues and reliability problems and mistakes, if that, in that alternate universe, and Max had to win so many races in a row to try and overhaul that, of course people would want to see that. But in a scenario where Max Verstappen is now, 93 points ahead of his teammate, 98 ahead of Charles Leclerc, and at this point in the season, nobody wants to see him go on and win the next 8 races in a row, or 7 races, or however many he needs to equal that 9 races in a row that Vettel did back in 2013. Unless you're a Max Verstappen or a Red Bull fan, of course. We shouldn't ignore them because, of course, they would love to see that in the same way that I love to see Michael Schumacher win so many races in his prime, and in your case, Sir Lewis Hamilton win so many races in a row in his prime. It's different depending on where your interest is, of course. But in terms of a competitive championship, I think we can all agree that if it was already gone beforehand, it's most likely already gone at this point. I think even the most diehard Ferrari fan at this point probably wouldn't be able to admit, and I'm one of them, probably wouldn't be able to acknowledge the fact that there's still a championship on. It just really isn't going to happen. And again, you just have to take your hat off to how great a job Red Bull have done. And we put a lot of investment on this technical directive being a factor. We really, really did. I myself, people that listen to this podcast will know that I was a little bit more reserved as to the impact. I acknowledge that it might actually play a part in trying to not necessarily help Mercedes, although that's ultimately what I thought was going on here, not directly at them, but just in terms of the F1 and the FIA looking at an opportunity to try and close the performance gap to the lead teams to the rest of the competition. I just felt that from Hungary, it was very circumstantial, the performance of Mercedes being the immediate competition compared to the top 2 teams. The track was colder than it should have been. It's a unique circuit that was going to favour certain characteristics, and by and large, Ferrari bottled it on strategy, which obviously helped a lot more in that regard. So, it was one of those where I did not think that this was going to be something that would be like a magic switch that would overhaul the pecking order. I thought it might bring Mercedes closer. What it has done, based on this one race alone, and it's a very, very small pool of evidence, but it does seem to me that it's pegged Ferrari back a little bit, but Red Bull have just found another gear and something crazy. And they did bring a host of upgrades as well, which may have played a part in this. But like you, Courtney, I just have no idea how anybody's going to be able to stop Red Bull and Max Verstappen right now.
No, I think the rest of the season would be a case of, learning about, the concepts that they've gone into this season, and hope to find some solutions in 2023. And I think it'd be something that people higher up will be looking at, because, there was so much talk, 2022 of there being much closer racing, allowing more teams to be involved in championship battles, etc., etc. And, right now we've got a continuation of one team dominating.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
Let's hope. Let's hope that, over the winter, the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes, I just have more faith in Mercedes. I was saying earlier on that, and I've probably said on here a few times in the past, that Ferrari were the hope, but you just can't rely on Ferrari to maintain a title challenge over the length of the season. We even saw it during the Mercedes dominance in 2017, 2018, and even to the extent 2019, where they come out the blocks fast, and then they just fall away. Whether it be where they go with the development, whether the high profile errors that they make, is something that Ferrari really need to look into because they're showing potential, and then they completely fall away. And for neutral fans, it not completely ruins the season, but it doesn't take that excitement right to the end the way that we saw. I don't think we've probably seen a really exciting end to an F1 inter-team battle since, well, you had last season, which was obviously disappointing with the Abu Dhabi thing. That was a great season, but you go back further than that in the turbo hybrid era, even going further back than that, you haven't really had a good battle since 2012 that Ferrari have been directly involved in. So, not even just for Ferrari fans, but for fans in general, you want to be seeing at least three teams in the championship battle because F1 is, it's getting more and more popular. It's gaining momentum, and you don't want to see that momentum getting lost by seeing one team dominating because people will lose interest.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, as I said, we can't blame Red Bull and Verstappen for this. They're just incredible. I mean, we should heap praise on them for what they've done today and the job that they've done. In your mind, Corny, what was the most impressive thing about Verstappen's performance today? I think, the fact that he was coming from P14, of course, we didn't have Yuki Tsunoda on the grid to take up his slot in P13, so that moved everybody up another spot. I mean, incidentally, we should also mention that this is one of the only Grand Prix in recent memory where nobody actually started in the position that they qualified in, which of course is not a good thing for Formula One because it kind of makes a mockery of this this system where you get engine penalties and that. And this season, of course, a lot of people are taking engine penalties. Obviously, Leclerc had some, Verstappen obviously had to take some for some new elements, and obviously it served an absolute treat for him. The car was like a rocket this weekend, but he managed to get all the way into the lead of the race, I think in about 12 laps. In a 44-lap race. It wasn't even a case of, can Verstappen get to the front? It was a case of, at what lap does he get to the front and then go on to win? I don't think many people would have expected him to get to the lead that quickly.
But going back to your previous question, I think the part that I probably found the most impressive was the level-headedness that he sort of showed, and that level of confidence, obviously having the confidence, that he took from last season and obviously the performance of the car, where we just saw him, having a cool approach to, carving his way through the field. Whereas with the Verstappen that we might have seen a couple seasons ago, would have made some bold or maybe rash decisions that could have compromised his race. We didn't see that. He seems to be a much more polished driver. Again, it'd be interesting to see if this, current Max Verstappen that we're seeing continues, if he's challenged in years to come. But right now, he is showing a maturity in his driving that has made him and Red Bull as formidable as they are at the moment.
Yeah, it really has. And I must admit, I was very impressed by that as well with Max. I mean, we've talked about Max in the past as a driver that doesn't always keep his head, or he gets a bit hot-headed in some difficult moments when he's under a bit of pressure. I think today, I don't think he was necessarily feeling the pressure. I think, in his mind, this was almost a little bit of an exhibition in terms of have a bit of fun, do some overtaking, in the same way as it was for Charles Leclerc for different reasons, of course. Neither of them perhaps thinking about the championship too much at this point because for different reasons they're kind of in a position where they don't have, there's a buffer there on either side of it. But for Max Verstappen, I was very impressed by the fact that he acknowledged very early on that the important part of the early stages of the race where, as we know at Belgium, and one of the things we love about this circuit is it's always chaotic when we get restarts or standing starts in the early stages. Then when it starts to sort of calm down a little bit and everyone shuffles into the positions that they're in for the race, that's when Max can make his move. And ultimately, Max did a very good job. I mean, there was some collisions, some incidents, which we'll talk about in a moment, that Max was very close to being caught up in as a passenger, and he did a great job to keep his nose clean, stay out of trouble, as all great winners and great drivers do, and then pick his moment when everything sort of calmed down. And that's when he made that progress. And of course, the safety car really did a favour for him as well to ease that opening stint. And then once he was released again, there was absolutely no stopping him. It was phenomenal stuff. Of course, we've said a lot about Max Verstappen on this already. It's a case in my mind of whether or when he wins this World Championship this season rather than if at the moment. I do want to talk a little bit about Sergio Perez if we can, because Sergio Perez in recent weeks before the summer break was struggling a little bit. He had a bit of a dip in form. Some people had put theories out suggesting that he was testing a new floor that was going to be compliant with the new technical directive, which we don't know if that's true or not. They were just rumours at this point. But when he drove today, by his own admission, Max was on another level. He was on another planet. He was flying out of there. But Sergio Perez, if it wasn't for his teammate, could have won this race very comfortably himself. In that second stint, he was so much faster than Sainz. And once he got ahead of him, he was pretty much in his own league in that regard as well.
Yeah, I think the fact that Sergio Perez was so comfortably in second just shows just how far ahead Red Bull are at the moment. Again, it sort of goes back to the Vettel Weber times for Red Bull, and then obviously Lewis and Rosberg and Lewis and Bottas. It was that level of dominance, but you kind of got it's always a sort of tangent that F1 fans really sort of look at. And first of all, on one side, it shows just how far Red Bull are, but then also like the gap between Max and Perez at the end, even considering that how far back Max was in comparison, just shows that exceptionally talented Max Verstappen is in comparison. And I just think it just shows it is very much Max Verstappen's team. And if you used to see Red Bull dominating in the future, and you had like another high-profile driver being interested in that second seat, it would. I can't see it happening, but it'd be like sort of Lewis and Alonso. So I can't see Red Bull bringing in a driver to replace Sergio Perez in the immediate future, because I just feel that dynamic suits them perfectly. Yes, Sergio Perez isn't performing anywhere close to his teammate, but he's still doing enough for the team, particularly when the team are performing as well as they are. If Ferrari and Mercedes were closer, then I do feel that Sergio Perez is becoming under a lot more scrutiny. But right now, everything's rosy for Red Bull. So why are they going to want to change anything in years to come?
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's a dynamic that I'm sure not a lot of people as purists would want to see. They want to see teammates fighting amongst each other and battling for supremacy in the team. But I think we can all agree, if you are Christian Horner, you are absolutely loving the dynamic right now. And this is a guy, of course, that has been put under a lot of scrutiny and pressure over what was going to be the outcome of this new technical directive when it kicked in. And to be fair to Christian, he always said it was something that they'd planned for. He felt they were always compliant with the regulations as they existed before this new TD came in. And he said he was never worried about what would be the outcome of what would be the outcome when that new technical directive did come in, and he had every right to be. I think he said somewhere along the lines of, as a quote, saying that regarding not just the regulation change for this season, but also for next season as well, which of course there's some changes over to the minimum ride height for that as well. And he was basically saying that, well, he's married to a Spice Girl, he has a great family, a great job, but he's not really going to worry about 10 millimeters. In that regard, if you catch the reference. And for those of you that got that, if you don't understand, ask an adult. And but discretion is advised, of course. And you gotta say, it's absolutely right to feel confident. If anything, it's actually helped them rather than hindered them in this regard. So you got to congratulate Red Bull for the incredible job that they are doing, and it's up to everybody else to try and catch them and try and make a competition of it. Whether it's going to be now or 2023, we'll have to wait and see. Whilst you've mentioned it, Courtney, Fernando Alonso and Sir Lewis Hamilton, former teammates, a big fiery inter-team rivalry that they had in McLaren, legendary one, to say the least, in 2007. We always felt that when Fernando came back to Formula One, was there going to be a scenario where Fernando and Sir Lewis locked horns, which ended up seeing them two come together? And to their credit, they've had their moments, but never quite come together. Today, however, was the day where it all kicked off a little bit, and it happened at turn 5 on lap 1. As we often say about the Camel Straight at Belgium at the opening scenes of the race, there's always going to be a potential for something like this to happen, and we got Lewis Hamilton having a collision with Fernando, which ended Lewis Hamilton's race, of course, with the damage that he received, and in a way hindered Fernando Alonso's and caused him a little bit of damage. Ultimately, result-wise, he probably wasn't too scathed by it anyway. How did you see that incident go down, Corny? Did you agree with the decision in that Lewis, by his own admission, was at fault in that incident?
Yeah, it was Lewis's fault. I think it's been a frustrating weekend for Mercedes, and he was a little bit too desperate to get that move on Alonso because look, we all know how famous Alonso is for holding people up and ruining their races. So I just think Lewis thought, look, I just need to get ahead of this guy, see what I can do about Sainz and Perez, and obviously Verstappen would have been charging through the field. And in that moment, he said he was in his blind spot. I just don't think he gave Alonso the space that he needed, and obviously there was the incident. I think Alonso's reaction was disappointing. You know, there is adrenaline rush. We all know they say silly things sometimes when they're obviously in the thick of the action. But for me, it just shows that the Fernando Alonso still has a lot of frustrations about what happened in 2007. And I do feel there is jealousy about how their respective careers went. I do believe there is a bit of that because obviously, you know, Lewis was his main competitor, and there had been a lot of talk back then. And also, you have a look back through their careers, as Lewis has apparently said, their careers went in completely different directions, and he does sometimes come across as a bit salty. He does
Yeah.
come across as salty, and that was definitely an example of it.
Yeah, I mean, for context, for those of you that aren't aware of what Fernando said in response to the incident on the team radio, he basically said, this guy knows how to drive and start in first. Basically saying that Lewis Hamilton doesn't know how to race unless he's leading the field with no one to compete with. And, you know, given the nature of the incident, it wasn't really that bad, really. I mean, Lewis just turned into him. Lewis's rear tyre went into Fernando's front tyre, and it sent Lewis, not flying, but it launched his car up a little bit, and it completely smashed the floor to pieces when it landed back down, which ultimately ruined Sir Lewis's race, and he wouldn't have been very happy about that. But, as you said, Courtney, the comments themselves from Fernando, probably a little bit inappropriate and uncalled for. Obviously, in the heat of the moment, you're going to say things like that. There are perhaps certain undertones and nuance to the rationale for a message like that and his thoughts towards Sir Lewis after their fiery rivalry all those years ago. I'm not really going to try and draw conclusions or try and draw a narrative from that. I'm going to let you, lovely lot, that listen and watch this podcast, do that for me and let me know in the comment section what you thought about what Fernando said about Sir Lewis Hamilton. I mean, we should also, whilst we'll critique Lewis for his mistake, we should also, to be fair to him, we have to praise him for being so magnanimous about this, because I can't imagine so many drivers that would have watched an incident despite the disappointment of ruining their race. And it could have been a very good day for Sir Lewis in that regard. Certainly a podium was on the cards, and he does end his run. I think it was, 6 podiums in a row before this race. He was in incredible form. So he really would have been disappointed about that incident happening so early and ruining his race. But, he went in front of Sky F1. He'd obviously seen the footage, and he said, looking back at it, he was in my blind spot. I didn't leave him enough space, and it was my fault. So you've got to praise him to own up and acknowledge that. He wasn't really interested in Fernando's comments. The media tried to throw that at him to get a response out of him, and he just said, not really interested, and just moved on. And to be honest, that's probably the best response, because I'm pretty sure Fernando might be annoyed about it, but after the race, the way it played out for him, finishing in P5, he'll probably look back at that and think, perhaps I shouldn't have said that. And, and that's how drivers are sometimes. They just think, it's heat of the moment. We're all like that a little bit sometimes, and we just move on. So, again, I'm going to let you guys draw a narrative conclusion from that.
I think Fernando Alonso is the one that needs to move on. It was 15 years ago.
Well, there you go. You can do it if you want, Courtney. I'm not going to get involved in that, because that's just a minefield in its own right. But I'll let you guys in the comment section, let me know what your thoughts were about that one as well. But I mean, in regards to Sir Lewis's race, of course, Fernando was able to salvage a pretty good result out of it for Alpine. I'm sure one that they'll be delighted with, considering that this is a driver that's leaving them next season to go elsewhere in their battle with McLaren, of course. So it was a bit disappointing for Sir Lewis. A podium, as you mentioned to me in the group chat, Courtney, during the race, probably might have been on the cards for him this afternoon.
Yeah, I don't quite know, again, with Ferrari's performance, but over the course of the race, George Russell was able to sort of claw back the advantage that Sainz had. If it wasn't for a mistake that George made with a few laps to go, he could have. There was a chance he could have caught Sainz. I think the straight line speed is still an issue for Mercedes, but it'd be interesting to see, if this race was a one-off, or if we're going to be seeing some battles between Mercedes and Ferrari for that second place in the Constructors' Championship for the rest of the season. I certainly hope so. Not only because of obviously my personal bias, but because we need to see some kind of entertainment at the front. Because right now Red Bull are sort of stealing the show. So yeah, let's hope with some entertainment further down. I think the battle that could probably be like the most feisty will be between Alpine and McLaren because of stuff that has not only happened on track but was going on off the field. So McLaren will still be going to midfield later on, but McLaren were disappointing today, and I hope McLaren up their game because again, neutral fan perspective, I think Alpine versus McLaren, if things head in a certain direction, that could well be the most interesting battle on the grid for the rest of the season.
Yeah, very much so. On the subject of Mercedes, with the incident between Hamilton and Alonso, there is a reason, there is a rationale for them to feel a little bit annoyed about how that played out. I mean, ultimately, of course, the FIA, the stewards, I should say, deemed the action as no investigation necessary following the collision. And I think ultimately that decision was made because of the fact that Sir Lewis had retired from the race. His punishment was the fact that his car was damaged to the point where he couldn't continue, and Fernando was able to carry on and salvage a good result out of it in the end. But I think Mercedes might be a little bit annoyed given the fact that a lot of people, Lewis included, rightfully so in my mind, acknowledge that Lewis was at fault in this incident. If we rewind back to the Austrian Grand Prix, a very similar incident happened between Sergio Perez and George Russell at turn 4. Now, if you remember, in that one, and I wrongly said on the podcast, I blamed George for this wrongly. I looked back at it and I realised that it was a mistake and I was wrong on this. But Sergio Perez was the one at fault in that incident. Yet George Russell was the one that got the penalty, and he was on the inside, on the curb, nowhere he could go. Perez turned in on him, and George was deemed to have been in the wrong, which wasn't the case. Shouldn't have been. Perez was at fault there. In this case, because of the fact that a lot of people acknowledge that Sir Lewis was at fault in there, do you think Mercedes will be right to feel annoyed about that? Think that it's a different perspective, and everyone seems to have changed their minds on this.
Well, yeah, but that's again down to the lack of consistency that happens with the stewarding. It's something that we've all been very vocal about for, I think, for actually throughout the time we've been doing this podcast. It's the lack of consistency which causes the annoyance, but it actually also causes the conspiracy theories that the FIA favour certain teams and drivers. You'll be seeing, I'm sure we've seen it a lot about how people feel that the FIA favour Red Bull, and obviously others will say that they favour Mercedes. And it's that kind of inconsistency that feeds that narrative. So, look, we've been saying it for ages, but the consistency is a real issue.
Yeah, and if they were consistent, just for context, for those of you that weren't sure what point I was getting at there, just to clarify, if they were consistent, Fernando would have been given a 5-second time penalty. Whether that's the right decision or not, and I don't believe it would have been if they'd have done that, but at least they would have been consistent with what they did with George in the Austrian Grand Prix. So I'm sure George would have probably seen that and thinking, well, where's Fernando's penalty? I mean, it didn't matter because George finished ahead of him anyway, but it's just nice to, if you're going to get, I mean, obviously I'm not advocating for decisions to be wrong, and people need to learn from their mistakes, and they obviously do. That's why we have these rules in place and obviously these revisions when they're necessary. But you obviously don't want to be the driver that's penalised for an incident that they get wrong, and then when they have the same incident with someone else and they don't get penalised when you were, you start to feel like, well, it's a little bit unjust almost. You want consistency. I think that's the best way of putting it. So, but obviously, talking about George Russell, I think he'll be relatively happy with today, given that how qualifying went down and he qualified in P8. I think he would have been a little bit worried that they might have struggled this afternoon. As it were, P4, not too far away from Carlos Sainz, who started on pole position and probably was a bit out of touch with George early in the race. So I think, despite the fact that he just missed out on P3, I think George would have been happy with a 4th place finish this afternoon.
Yeah, I think George Russell sort of, his performance today just sums up where Mercedes are as a team. Capable of challenging for podiums, but just nowhere near the Red Bull. It's just a shame. I just think that if Mercedes just had the pace with the driver pairing that they have, I would have just trusted them so much more than Ferrari to give us a good title battle towards the end of the season. But look, it is what it is. I think George Russell settled into Mercedes so well. Obviously, he was a junior driver, so the transition wasn't too difficult for him. But I just think if Mercedes develop a car with that driver pairing, they could really be formidable next season.
Yeah, absolutely. We should, well, I mean, in terms of Mercedes, Courtney, I suppose we have to ask the question, what is the right course of action for them now? Should they focus purely on 2023? Should they even be worried about trying to beat Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship this season? Because, you know, this afternoon, Mercedes, I think what we saw this weekend with Mercedes is, despite the fact there was some hope that they might be able to make up some ground with this new technical directive going live, ultimately, excluding the fact that Ferrari obviously had a difficult weekend and got some things wrong, which obviously mitigated their own performance and hindered their own performance in that regard, it wasn't a true reflection of what Ferrari should have been capable of. It's just what happened on the day, as it has been in Hungary and a few races before that. But Mercedes still have a lot of problems that they need to sort out with this car. Despite the fact that this car practically has no side pods, it's still a very draggy car. And it's a car that obviously still has some inconsistencies, doesn't warrant the grip that the Red Bull and the Ferrari does in certain traction zones. Yes, there are positives and improvements, but there's still a long way to go. So in your mind, what should the focus of Mercedes be going forward? Should they put their eggs in the 2023 basket, try to get on terms with what's going on with this car and learn and use that to their advantage going forward? Or do you think that they should still be going maximum attack for the rest of the season to try and, at the very least, overhaul Ferrari for P2?
I think it all depends on the concept they're going to go with. If they're going to go with a completely, not a completely new concept, if they're going to go with a fairly new concept for next season, then of course they need to be looking on to next season. But I just feel that if they want to be winning races and be in a championship contending position next season, they need to understand what's caused the issues that they've had this season. And the only way they're going to get that is by hard data and, putting the work into this year's car. So it all depends on whether Mercedes feel they can find the answers this season and sort of have a more better polished version of this concept, or if they're going to go for a new concept next season.
Yeah, very much so. Before we move on to Ferrari, we should mention some good news. Now, of course, in our last episode, we talked in great length about the fact that this could potentially be the final Belgian Grand Prix for some time. As it is, this morning, on the day of the race, they announced that they're going to be having a Belgian Grand Prix on next season's calendar. Now, there have been some rumours going around saying that there have been issues with the talks with the Kyalami circuit in South Africa, which has created a possible opening for Belgium to slot in for next season. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I can't really speculate on it because I don't really know much more than that. That said, it is very, very good news for Belgian Grand Prix supporters, F1 purists in certain regards, and of course everyone involved at the Spa circuit. We had a quote from Mohammed Ben Sulayem, the FIA president, saying that I am very happy and pleased that the Belgian Grand Prix will be on the calendar proposed to the World Motorsport Council by FOM for 2023. Spa-Francorchamps is an iconic circuit and a special place for Formula One. Now that's a really important quote from the FIA president to acknowledge how special the Spa-Francorchamps circuit is to a lot of F1 fans and F1 in general. So, Courtney, of course, the question remains, are we going next year for the finale at Spa, potentially for next year or beyond that? What are we thinking?
Given my previous memories of Spa and also considering the Orange Army has increased incredibly since then, I'd have to be very picky about which campsite I'll stay out if I was to go to Spa next season.
Oh, that's all right. Well, I'll wear my Ferrari shirt. You can wear your Hamilton Mercedes shirt. We'll just be defiant against them anyway. I'm sure we'll be all right. We might be able to get a Legion to sort of help us out here, but it might be literally 2 against an entire Orange Army out there. So
what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. What could possibly go wrong? But do you know, it's funny. We talk about the Orange Army a lot on this show, and you know what? The majority of them, we must acknowledge, they are a great supporter base. There are obviously going to be a minority. A few people that obviously ruin it for the rest of them and the rest of us, obviously, by extension. Every fan base has them to a certain degree, and obviously we don't want those people involved in F1 because they're not really proper F1 fans. They're just idiots by and large. But, it is a great support that they have for Max Verstappen, the Orange Army in particular. And it's a great thing for Formula One to have new sets of fans in the sport, whichever camp that you find yourselves in. What I find interesting and fascinating is how are they still allowed to bring flares and smoke bombs and stuff like that, or these orange smoke flares that they bring in. Like, how is that even allowed? And more importantly, surely the drivers, they can't see very well through them at some point, because we've seen stuff like that before. I remember in Austria earlier in the season, you couldn't really see much on the TV cameras. I'm thinking, how do the drivers see that? How are they allowed to get in with these flares?
Do you know what? The day will come where it will hinder Max Verstappen's race. Could you imagine? Because like we always say at football games, don't you? Like when you're, do you remember the famous Darren Bent goal against Liverpool when they threw a beach ball onto the Liverpool fans threw a beach ball onto the pitch? Darren Bent, struck the ball, deflected off the Liverpool beach ball, and then went into the Liverpool goal. And let's not rule out. You imagine next week. You go to Zandvoort, orange smoke everywhere. Max is most likely going to be leading a race, I don't know, after a safety car or something. He gets his vision impaired going into turn 1, goes off and loses the race. And you imagine the mayhem that would cause him within the fan base. But you don't want to spoil people's fun. I think that's the important thing. You don't want to spoil people's fun. Unfortunately, every village has them. But you don't want to be spoiling the fun for everyone else. Look, I've said it before. I'm a West Ham fan. And, some of the West Ham fans have a spicy reputation, I think, to say the least. And at the end of the day, I'm not that way inclined. So you don't want to be tarring everybody with the same brush. But yeah, I just think, look, Max Verstappen's going to be around. He's going to be at the top for a very long time. And I just feel that moving forward, if the percentage of his fan base continue to behave badly, then it's something that needs to be looked into. But you're right, Adam, you don't want to be tarring everybody with the same brush.
No, I'm just fascinated that they're allowed to still bring in those orange flares. I mean, surely, I know what you're saying, surely it's going to be a danger to the drivers. I don't know. I haven't seen a safety car ever be called out owing to excessive flares and smoke on a circuit, but we're going to Zandvoort next weekend. So if it's going to be anywhere, it's probably going to be there, because literally it's going to be an orange sea out there as it was last season. So I can only imagine what the atmosphere is going to be like. To be honest, I'd probably love to actually be there in person to witness it, because it's probably going to be quite fun, even though it's not the camp that I tend to reside in as an F1 fan and where my biases tend to lie. But speaking of my biases, we should move on to Ferrari, of course. And I want to start with the positives. Carlos Sainz got a podium. I think he drove pretty well today, all things considered, despite the fact that he was on pole and was leading the race in the opening stint. And Ferrari have moved ahead of McLaren. Moved further ahead of Mercedes. I should say they already had a McLaren. Moved further ahead of Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship, despite some of their shortcomings today. By and large, that was owed to the fact that Sir Lewis Hamilton didn't finish today. That's probably about as far as it goes in terms of the positives. I mean, first of all, they were nowhere near Red Bull. I've never seen Ferrari so far away from Red Bull in a long time, and never even looked like... I mean, there was always a sense of inevitability about the fact that Red Bull, once Verstappen had gotten up to the lead group, that Sainz, it was just only a matter of time before he got beat, not just by Max, but also by Sergio as well. Ferrari obviously went the wrong way on setup. Not only did they put too much downforce on their car, which compromised them in the straights, they also had more tyre wear, which is crazy. I mean, there are some cases where that's obviously apparent, but that's down to the nature and characteristics of a certain car. But normally, if you want to preserve tyre wear, you bolt more downforce on your car just so that you're not trying to work your tyres as hard. I know you subject them to more loads, but if you don't work them as hard, you should be able to preserve tyre life compared to some of the others that were obviously running less downforce. So Ferrari went wrong there. And strategy again. I don't honestly what is going on when it comes to Leclerc. And of course, Leclerc made a bit of a mistake himself, but more strategy mistakes. It just, for me, Courtney, and also they were asking questions on the radio to both their drivers about what they wanted to do. And it's like, part of me feels like, I don't want to be rude and disrespectful, but part of me does feel like sometimes, you know what, if that's what they're going to do, I might as well sit on the pit wall.
Yeah, it's their job, isn't it?
And I'm thinking, who is actually making these decisions? Is someone actually telling them or micromanaging this situation? And if so, who is doing it? Because they're obviously not doing a very good job. Everybody there is just second-guessing themselves right now. Mattia Binotto, by his own admission, has basically said now that if Ferrari are going to win this championship, Max Verstappen has to have some DNFs and quickly, because right now it's a one-horse race, quite literally. And for me, the mood is very, very flat right now. You know, so I mean, how can we sum up Ferrari's weekend? It did look somewhat promising, but it pretty much evaporated after 12 laps of racing for both their guys.
I think the sum up, again, I'm hoping it's a one-off. Not only do you had like the typical Ferrari mistakes, yeah, they weren't as high profile as they have been throughout the season, but the one saving grace for Ferrari is that they had the performance at least. That seems to have disappeared for now. So with Monza coming up, really have to find some solutions. Obviously, going into Zandvoort, that's going to be the Max Verstappen homecoming part two, because obviously let's not forget that Belgium effectively is the first time racing Max Verstappen, and then you go on to Ferrari homeland, and there'll have been a lot of hope from the Ferrari faithful that they got a car fast enough to win at Monza. Right now, it's not looking great, so they'll be really hoping to find some answers in the next couple of weeks. I do feel they'll go to Zandvoort, with not as much energy, and they save that energy going into Monza, but they're going to have to do something, because I think for Ferrari, it'd be more disappointed than most seasons if they weren't to win that race, because they know that they've had the potential, they've had a race-winning car this season. So, as I said, next couple of weeks are going to be vital for Ferrari.
Oh, absolutely. I can imagine after the first three races, many Ferrari fans, myself included, would have been licking their lips at the prospect of, oh, can't wait for Monza. That's going to be a fantastic day to see both the Ferraris, perhaps a 1-2, maybe in their wildest dreams. Not saying it can't happen, it could happen, but right now, if there's going to be a 1-2, there's only one team right now that looks like they're going to do it, and it's not going to be Ferrari. Ironically, the race next week in Zandvoort, probably Ferrari's best opportunity for a little while to win a race, just because of the nature of the circuit, high downforce circuit, a lot of medium high-speed corners where Ferrari have been good at. It's a good chassis as well, so Ferrari will fancy it. I mean, we saw Dr. Helmut Marko saying that in spite of Red Bull's incredible performance, he was saying there's still more to come. They need to take more weight off this car. They introduce a new lightweight chassis, which he reckons is going to give them an extra few tenths in performance when that is eventually finished. That wasn't on the car this weekend, so you can only imagine how much better they're going to be. I know, you're literally, if you're not watching this right now, guys, if you're listening to this on audio-only platforms, Courtney right now, his face, he's literally an embodiment of a man whose heart is sinking in front of you, just at the prospect of how much better can Red Bull get right now. It's absolutely crazy. And, as a Ferrari and a Mercedes fan, and anyone that isn't a Red Bull fan right now, obviously it's going to pain you to sort of imagine how that's going to sort of unfold. Of course, other teams will do their part to catch up if they can, but it is quite a scary thought right now. But with Ferrari, I honestly don't really know what more I can say. I'm not surprised anymore. I mean, we joked about this in the past, saying, it's Ferrari for you, Ferrari are going to Ferrari themselves, but every race now it's a case of what are they going to do, how are they going to mess this up. I mean, in qualifying, Charles Leclerc, obviously, he was only out there to give his teammate a bit of a tow, but then, of course, he didn't know if he was going to use those tyres to go on a flying lap. Ferrari at the last minute say, yeah, okay, had no time to prepare his tyres properly. Then he said, oh, what are these tyres? And then they said, oh, it's a mistake. And it's like, this is qualifying. Yeah. It's not even the race yet. And then when it comes to the race, Charles Leclerc, well, I mean, he was very unlucky at the start of the race. Like Verstappen, he was moving up through the field. There was a suggestion that Max Verstappen had taken a bit of his tear off on his visor and released it on the way down to Blanchimont and past Stavelot. And apparently that piece of turnoff ended up going into Charles Leclerc's car behind him, which caused the front right brake duct issues and the cooling problems, which forced Leclerc to have to make that early pit stop. So, of course, I'm not suggesting Max Verstappen deliberately did a Mario Kart and with a banana and fry it back and causes Leclerc problems. I mean, that would be quite funny. But in a weird way, that's kind of the real-life equivalent, really. If that is, and obviously it's accidental. These things can happen sometimes. It's just happened to Leclerc on this occasion. So, if that is the case, that's just crazily bad luck. But he was able to recover his performance somewhat. Then Ferrari was second-guessing on strategy of what to do. Oh, do you want to pit now?
Plan D. It's Plan D today.
Plan D. I mean, they weren't the worst. McLaren with Norris, that was suggesting that Plan G wasn't an option for them. So it's like they need more alphabet. I don't know who goes for all these plans, draws them up for all these scenarios. They must do. I mean, absolutely crazy stuff that they have to go through. But and then, of course, fast forward towards the end of the Grand Prix when Charles Leclerc was in P5, fastest lap might have been a possibility. Ferrari bring him in. Leclerc wasn't feeling confident he had the pace, despite having a new set of soft tyres available to, or a used set of softs, I should say, available to him, because he used the new ones at the start of the race, which completely were wasted anyway. And not only did he not get the fastest lap, but he got a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. He was 1 kilometre faster than the limit of 80 kilometres an hour, so he ended up losing P5 anyway to Fernando Alonso after having to re-overtake him again. I think I've got that all in there. Long story short, Ferrari just Ferrarying themselves to new levels all the way through the organisation right now, Corny. My poor old heart can't keep taking this. I mean, what is going on? Honestly.
It's like Ferrari have they've accepted that they have a role to play in a race weekend. So you have
what's that? The comic relief.
Yeah, but basically, so I remember last season, we always used to joke about an Alfa Romeo finishing 11th. Well, I think Ferrari have accepted that every single race they're just going to find new ways to make fools of themselves and further embarrass their fan base. On a serious note, this was a real chance for them this season, and they've completely and utterly messed it up. Not only with the strategy errors and the poor communication with the drivers, but in terms of development, it's been so disappointing. They had so much promise, and I've said this several times in this episode already. Not only have they let themselves and their own fans down, they've let down the non-Red Bull and Verstappen fans down, because they've robbed us of some entertaining races. Look, we love F1. We'll be watching the races, but we're not going to go into these races with nowhere near the level of excitement that I thought we would have been at the start of the season.
Yeah, you're right. I'm going to move on to something a bit more positive, because Ferrari are depressing me now. If any of you guys want to give me any sort of tips on how to deal with that with Ferrari, if you want to get your own thoughts on Ferrari, let me know in the comment section if you're watching this on YouTube. But I'm going to move on to something a bit more positive, because I'm going to end up sounding like one of their drivers right now, trying to find positives that just aren't really there right now. But Esteban Ocon, Alpine. We talked about Alonso. Obviously, Alonso getting P5 by virtue of that 5-second penalty for Leclerc. Big points for the Alpine team. More big points from Esteban Ocon. On a weekend where McLaren were struggling, Alpine needed to respond to the form that McLaren was showing before the summer break, and they did just that. Ocon, for me, being a personal highlight, not just with one double overtake, but with 2 double overtakes. One very reminiscent of the famous overtake that Mika Hakkinen pulled off on Michael Schumacher when they both lapped Ricardo Zonta in the year 2000 at the Belgian Grand Prix, and then him overtaking Schumacher round the outside of turn 5. Probably the best overtake I think I've ever seen watching Formula 1. And it was a nice little homage to that from Esteban Ocon today when he overtook Pierre Gasly and Sebastian Vettel in a very similar fashion. And I've got to say, Corny, I really enjoyed that. It was some great driving from Esteban Ocon this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. He was one of the drivers in that midfield battle, but one of the best performances, obviously, aside from Alonso. I just think he's relishing the role that he has at Alpine at the moment. If you have a look at Esteban Ocon's F1 career, it's always been a tad unstable. When he was a Mercedes junior driver, there's always a sense of, is he going to be there next season, or is he going to have a seat in F1 at all? He's finally cemented himself a place in the F1 grid. He has an element of safety with everything that's going on around him, and I think he's relishing in that, and I think that's why we're seeing much more consistency from him. He's always shown glimpses, he's always shown good drives. Obviously with Hungary last year being a prime example of it. But yeah, he's showing a consistency and a confidence in a driver that has has finally made himself a part of the F1 furniture, and I think I can see him having a strong end to the season.
Yeah, I can too, and it's really important right now, not just for Alpine, but for Esteban Ocon, that this is a time right now where he really needs to get his head down and most importantly, prove to the team that he is the guy to back going forward. It's very easy to think that Alpine is Fernando Alonso's team. Of course, in 6 months' time, that's not going to be the case when he moves on to Aston Martin for 2023. So for Ocon, this is a driver that has been very under the radar this season, I think, given by the fact that his teammate is just box office, whether it's good or bad reasons. But Ocon is the guy that's picked up most of the points this season for the Alpine team, for one reason or another. He's put together the performances on a regular basis. Today was an opportunity, I think, for people to sort of get to see him a little bit under the microscope, a little bit more than they would have done, and ultimately try and set down the right credentials and foundations that he'll need to take that team going forward next season and beyond, regardless of who they get to partner him alongside him, whether that's going to be Oscar Piastri, or whether that's going to be Mick Schumacher, or even Pierre Gasly in some of the wildest imaginations. I'm not sure who it's going to be. Maybe Daniel Ricciardo as well. Ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to ask here, Courtney, and this is another one I want you guys to get in the comments section as well. I think this is a really good one worth responding to. Is Esteban Ocon ready to lead a team like Alpine? And more importantly, should Alpine put their eggs in that basket and put him in a position to lead that team going forward?
I think it depends on who replaces Fernando Alonso. I think if Piastri was to join, for example, or another driver from F2 or perhaps F3, then Esteban would absolutely be the leader of that team. I think if someone like Daniel Ricciardo was to go back, I just think with the race winning experience and the character as well that Daniel brings with him, I still feel Daniel would still take the edge. But then we've seen it with Esteban Ocon's previous experiences with Sergio Perez. He won't just sit down and be a number two driver. He's shown hunger throughout his F1 career to be a number one driver. And you're right, Adam, this is going to be his best opportunity yet to be a number one driver in a team.
Well, I think so too. And I think, if it were me personally, if I was Otmar Zafner, I would absolutely be encouraging Esteban to now take on this role as a bit of a team leader. Perhaps he's doing it already, or he was doing it whilst Fernando was there anyway. I mean, this is a guy that last season Alpine did back with a new few-year contract, multi-year deal, if you like, which is not very common in Formula One. It must be said, most drivers do tend to drive with contracts 1 year after the other. It's almost like living paycheck to paycheck in that regard. You literally are just working to stick around. In this case, they have backed him for a few years, and I'd be absolutely encouraging him, regardless of who his new teammate. I mean, I could make a case almost for all of the realistic candidates for that seat for next season, and there's a huge list of them right now, that Esteban should be the leader of that team regardless of who goes in. Even if it's Daniel Ricciardo, I think Esteban should be making sure that he's the team leader in that team and driving it going forward. Whether he's capable of doing that, I guess we're going to find out. But given how well Alpine are doing this season, I would say he's doing a pretty good job in that regard. So he just has to keep that going. Of course, we've seen that he's still a few seconds of pace ultimately off Fernando Alonso over a race distance, and we saw that again today. But he's doing a good job. And I think, you can't really fault that. And this season, against McLaren, all those points are going to add up. We should move on to McLaren. And, it was a very difficult day for them. Norris P12, Ricciardo in P15, ultimately in the same piece of track. They were in that long gaggle of cars fighting on the fringes of the points. But it'll be very disappointing seeing that, Norris started P7 today. Sorry, not P7. Ricciardo started P7 today. Norris was P17, actually. So Norris was one of the people that had an engine penalty. Norris might have fancied himself to still have the pace to get into the points. She showed his performance in qualifying. He was pretty good there. Ricciardo, given his future's been sort of confirmed at this point that he's not going to be at McLaren, perhaps his motivation right now has probably been hindered to a point where perhaps he's not really worried about where he ends up. He probably feels his existing stock is enough to get him a seat somewhere. And it just wasn't showing it in the race today. And McLaren just really struggled. And they can't afford to lose ground to Alpine now in this Constructors' Championship because it's so tight between them. But they lost, 16 points to them today in this Constructors' Championship battle right now, which has now given Alpine a 20-point lead ahead of them. McLaren really need to get their act together and fast. It cannot be a precedent for what's to come based on what we saw today.
Yeah, just given everything that we just discussed, the harsh reality is that Alpine have two drivers that are on their game, and McLaren only have one. And even then, that doesn't seem to be enough because performance-wise, they didn't seem to be there. But Lando has those flashes of greatness in him, so he might be able to get some big point performances from maybe one or two podiums before the end of the season that can really aid McLaren. But going back to Dan Ricciardo, we saw the video that he released announcing he's leaving McLaren, and it was gutting to watch because the guy did seem genuinely gutted. I thought the move was going to be a fantastic move for him. For whatever reason, the way that car runs, I don't know, maybe the way that McLaren's run as a team doesn't suit him. And I do hope that if he does get a move, it will be back to Alpine because he seemed to do well there. And I do get the feeling that if he was to go back there, we'd see him get back into form again because, Danny Ricciardo's, class and ability beyond the wheel hasn't just disappeared overnight. I do believe this is a team-specific issue.
I want to throw another name at you for a potential driver to go in this Alpine seat for next season. Alex Albon. Because, and this is a driver that's not really been linked with this seat, whilst, he obviously is confirmed for Williams for next season. He signed a multi-year deal anyway. I don't know if that's probably, why Alpine aren't really interested or we haven't heard anything on this subject because he has that contract laid down. But he's not going to be tied to the Red Bull team in the way that he was this season on loan, technically speaking. I know there's going to be certain nuances of this agreement there where he's technically not 100% separated from Red Bull in this regard. But I find it interesting that given how well he's driving at the moment, and he showed this today, of course, this weekend, P6 on the grid. I mean, I think he was, what was he? He was in the top 10. He was on the top 10, yeah.
Yeah, top 10. Wasn't that my bold prediction? I swear I said that Albon would finish in the points.
Yeah, you might have said. This is terrible, guys. I can't remember half the stuff that we say in these previews. I know my prediction was wrong because I backed Sir Lewis Hamilton to win today, and that ended up going kaput after 5 corners. So yeah, maybe I should predict Lewis to come last, and maybe he'll win. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way my predictions go. They're just a curse these days. But well, given the amount of times I backed Ferrari to win races and they didn't, there's probably somewhere along some truth to that, I suppose. But no, with Albon, I find it interesting that he's a driver that might not be considered an outside choice. Maybe it is because he's tied down to Williams and that the media aren't really throwing his name in there, but it's never stopped some people before when they've had commitments. I mean, that's kind of what this whole thing with Piastri is. Of course, we should stress, Courtney, that on the subject of Pierre Gasly, the World Motorsport Council, and I can't remember what the name of the organisation is, but basically the people that deal with contract regulation in the FIA are going to review this case between McLaren and Alpine to basically determine if Oscar Piastri is within his rights to say to Alpine, no thanks for the seat, I'm going to McLaren. Because right now it does seem, it seems very much that if Piastri doesn't get his wish and go to McLaren, he may not end up at Alpine either. It might just be a case of whether Alpine can legally sort of sue him and his management over this business. It's very, very messy stuff right now. But yeah, that's kind of another battle going on between Alpine and McLaren off the track as well.
Yeah, I'd be very, very shocked if Oscar Piastri doesn't get an F1 seat. I don't know what the situation is with Latifi, but surely if he wasn't able to drive for McLaren, surely he'd be looking at a Williams seat. Or maybe that's the seat that maybe Ricciardo would look at. Maybe because, I sometimes completely forget about Williams. Maybe Ricciardo would go to Williams and partner up with Albon, which wouldn't actually be a bad driver partnership for that team at all.
No, I think Williams are kind of sitting there and just biding their time. They're waiting to see what's happening, put the feelers out if they need to. Again, I like Latifi, but I'd be very surprised if he was driving on the 2023 grid. I think a lot would have to happen for that to actually be the case. I think if they wanted to keep him, they'd have done it by now. He's been given a lot of reprieves already. But no, great day for Alex Albon and Williams. Brilliant performance this weekend. He was absolutely incredible in qualifying. And he had a strong performance in the race. Made some good overtakes as well. And of course, he didn't fall away. His performance was good. And that's the kind of thing Williams really, really needed. So no, great job from him. We should talk about Aston Martin. Of course, we mentioned them briefly in all of this with Fernando Alonso. Lance Stroll just missing out. He was in that gaggle of cars fighting for points. P11. Sebastian Vettel in P8. And I want to pay special homage to Sebastian Vettel because not only is the fact that he scored a brilliant goal in a charity match the other weekend, and I know some Premier League sides are looking for a new striker. Maybe they should give Seb a contract once his F1 career is finished. They could do with him up front. A very tidy finish indeed. But also a solid performance in P8 and a fantastic start. I don't know if you saw the replay, Courtney, of Sebastian Vettel's start. It was an absolute rocket off the line, getting him near the front. And it was a big part why he managed to get in the points this weekend. He was quite far down in qualifying. I was just trying to look back where he started. It was, where did he start? P10. And he just took off like a rocket, and he was well inside the top 5 for most of the race, and then, of course, fell away towards the end of it, but a solid P8 position, and he had a nice few little battles as well with Ocon and Gasly.
Yeah, I think that these are the sort of battles that Sebastian Vettel's been missing. You know, he's kind of been in limbo the last couple of seasons, and I think if Aston Martin were to show more promise about where they're going, I think Sebastian Vettel might have had another season in F1. But unfortunately, we are losing him. But no, that today was an example, because I was keeping an eye on his performance, and at one stage I was going to put him down as my driver of the day. But some sort of glimmers of hope, though, for Aston Martin. They seem to be sort of, instead of being sort of towards the back in the midfield battle, they seem to be able to keep up more with the likes of Alpine and McLaren. So that might give us a bit more of a tasty element of the midfield battle between Alpine and McLaren. Maybe Aston Martin will play a part in that by taking points off one, if not maybe two, of the drivers from either team.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Pierre Gasly finishing in P9 for AlphaTauri today. It was their first points finish in 6 races, I believe. I know we talked about them really. I know it was crazy to think that. And Gasly had a very good weekend himself. Of course, this is a circuit that has different kind of memories for him. Not necessarily great ones, unfortunately. This is where he lost his great late friend Antoine Hubert, which is a devastating shame, obviously, when that happened a few years ago. Probably would have been on the F1 grid today if it wasn't for that. So obviously a very emotional venue for him, but a great performance on the day for him. Much more like the old Pierre Gasly that we know and love. But this is kind of interesting now, because there's a nice little battle starting to develop between Haas, AlphaTauri and Aston Martin for P7 now. Just looking at the Constructors' Championships, we've got Haas on 34 points, AlphaTauri on 29 points, Aston Martin on 24 points. It's going to start getting quite tasty between those 3 teams. And as I said, Tsunoda, you know, he was really bogged down by the fact that he had to start from the pit lane because he qualified in P13. He might have been able to get in the points himself this afternoon if he actually started where he was intended to, and Gasly was qualified inside the top 10, so it could get interesting. And Haas, as we expected, starting to struggle a bit. They didn't have a great weekend either. Magnussen and Schumacher were a long way
barely saw them.
Yeah, well, that's it. They were both a lap down today. They were the last cars to be lapped along with Latifi, and they look completely out of place this weekend. All the Ferrari runners really struggled this weekend, surprisingly. So it is a cause for concern in that regard. And it could be something that towards the end of the season, AlphaTauri and Aston Martin might think P7 might be on the cards.
Yeah, I think like even Alfa Romeo, they showed some. They showed glimpses. There are some teams that show some really good glimpses on a Friday and sometimes on a Saturday, and they completely fall back. Like I think even Alfa Romeo, obviously Bottas went out, but they seem to have a quiet race. I could barely remember seeing an Alfa Romeo, a Haas, and Latifi. Apart from that incident, we barely saw them. It just seems like there's like a little sort of invisible mini league going on in the F1 world. You want to be seeing every team get some representation, but right now you've got 2 or 3 teams that are sort of falling back at a vital part of the season.
Well, Bottas's race was ruined by trying to avoid Latifi when he had to spin a few laps in on the exit of turn 6, and Bottas, wrong place at the wrong time, avoided Latifi, but he ended up beaching his own car and cost him in that race. And of course, he started up pretty well. He was P13 and he made a few places off the start, and it really ruined his race. Zhou Guanyu, of course, he started a lot further down the order because he had one of the grid penalties. I mean, the crazy thing about qualifying, Courtney, is, and this kind of sums it up why it was a bit of a mess in Belgium this weekend with engine penalties and stuff, and maybe it's something they need to review for the rules for future races 100%. Because Bottas qualified P20, knew he was going to have engine penalties anyway, so he didn't even bother. I think it was like a second and a half slower than whoever it was that qualified P15 to get into Q2. And he qualified P20, had 30 place grid penalty, and he started in P13. Like, how does that happen? I mean, I'm sure there's a perfectly logical reason for why that happened, and within the rules, someone, I'm sure, will I'll be very grateful for one of you guys that listen to this show to explain to me in the comments how that happened. But that just makes an absolute mockery and mess of qualifying. If Bottas can do that, and in theory he should have been starting in Brussels, let alone in P13 or back of the grid. But there we are. It's just about the way the rules are. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be reviewed. Look, I completely understand the principle of it, about, being cost effective and, the environmental aspect of it as well. But it does make a mockery of the sport when you're sort of seeing, drivers with all these grid penalties being sort of diced about. And then this morning we saw Tsunoda had to take one as well. And there was a little bit of intrigue about the fact that both of the Alpha Tauris took grid penalties, which would have led Max Verstappen going up a couple of places. It is a little bit shambolic, Again, F1's growing in popularity, and with that becomes a higher level of scrutiny. You need to start overlooking these kind of things because, if this becomes more of a regular feature, which we probably expect it to be because, these cars are being developed rapidly with it being a new regulation. Over the next couple of seasons, we're going to be seeing this more and more and more. So 100% is something that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I'm not quite sure what that is. I think it was, it might have been Will Buxton or Karen Chennock. I can't remember who it was that proposed perhaps that they should have a points penalty allocated in constructors' points when teams have to take new engines. But I think that stuff might get messy if you started implementing that sort of thing. Where do you draw the line with that, if you like? I think we've pretty much covered all the main talking points for the race this weekend. I don't think we've forgotten anything, but of course, let us know if we have and what your thoughts on those points are in particular. We're going to be going to Zandvoort next for the second part of the triple header, and based on what we saw right now, I don't want to cast any early predictions because we'll be doing that in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. But Courtney, right now, if you are invested in this F1 World Championship and you're not a Red Bull fan or a Max Verstappen fan, what are you going to be holding on to that's going to get you excited for the Dutch Grand Prix, other than the fact that it's F1 and we absolutely love it, regardless of who's dominating and who isn't?
Possibly seeing Ferrari against Mercedes. I'd like to see some battles between Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. We haven't seen enough of those, I feel.
No, we haven't, have we?
So hopefully we...
That's one battle we saw back in Monza 2019 when Ferrari were running the technically illegal, but we never will know if it was illegal engine. And they had that little moment where Charles was a little bit naughty, forcing Lewis off a little bit. And he only got the warning flag on the day. And to be honest, he wouldn't have got a penalty because there's no way the stewards would have got out of Monza alive if they'd have took that victory off of Charles Leclerc. So make of that what you will. But no, we haven't had many duels between those two. I can't really remember one since, really. I know he was involved in that one at Silverstone, but that was a bit of a trio battle with Perez. And so that'd be something I'd look forward to. It's a shame because we could have got something like that today, perhaps with Sir Lewis and Sainz, up there as well. So it's probably not a bad idea. I'd like to see a bit more fights between Mercedes and Ferrari, even though neither of which are going to be winning races in the short term by the looks of it. But it would be quite fun.
You got, I'll say that, and then also the midfield battle, particularly between McLaren and Alpine. Surely with the ongoings off track as well, let's get a bit of spice from that because it was disappointing from McLaren today. So let's see McLaren in the fold. Yeah,
this should be a much better race for them. Of course, they were right up there with Alpine in Hungary, and Zandvoort is a little bit like Hungary in that regard. It's not quite Monaco without the barriers, but a lot of high-speed downforce warranting corners. So certainly something that's going to pique the interest of the purists out there. And of course, we already talked about the Aston Martin, AlphaTauri and Haas battle that is slowly developing, and I'm sure we'll see more of that in the spotlight as this season draws on. But of course, plenty of racing to go. Overall, much better than what we got last season, although we actually got 2 laps in this time, so obviously that's a big win for Belgium. We're going to be going there next season.
That's the good news.
That's the good news. Us personally, we'll have to wait and see. But you know what? Hopefully F1 will deliver. It's been good so far. We had a race which kind of worried people in terms of, what the competition was going to be like, but hopefully we'll get more of that as the season draws into its next chapter. But guys, As always, if you have enjoyed this episode, please do support us if you can by giving us a like and consider subscribing to the DNF1 F1 podcast on YouTube. We're very close to 800 subscribers. Of course, we're chasing 1,000 by the end of the season. You guys, you know what you got to do. Give us a like, subscribe to the channel, absolutely free to join the DNF1 family. We'd absolutely love to have you. And of course, if you can, please do consider supporting us on your favorite podcasting platform. If you listen to us on audio only format, the only way to do that is give us a nice review. If you think we're worthy of 5 stars, please do consider doing that. We'd really appreciate that. We're really grateful for those of you that do. And of course, if you feel that we're not worthy of 5 stars, you want to give us something less, that's absolutely fine. But please do leave a written review for us if you can. Reason I ask is because we try to make the show as good as we can for you lovely lot. And you guys are the most important part of this. We can't do this without your support. And this is why we are here today. And of course, we're very grateful for that. And I know some of you guys don't think that we're fantastic. You don't think that we're incredible. You think we're okay, but can be better. And we're absolutely fine with that. We'd appreciate that honesty from you guys. We absolutely love that because we need that to improve. We don't want everyone to tell us that we're the best thing going, because as much as we love to hear that from time to time, and we do get 1 or 2 of you lovely that do tell us that, and it means the world that you tell us that. And I know I'm going on a little bit here, but I'm going to get around to sorting it out eventually. We want you guys that don't think that we're amazing to tell us why. Let us know, and please be honest and be constructive. I don't want people saying, oh, Hamilton bias, British bias, oh, you like Max, or you're too obsessed about Ferrari. We know. We're all of those things and none of those things. That's fine. I want you guys to tell us something that we can make the show better about, rather than just say, oh, you need to be nicer to that person or stuff like that. Give us constructive feedback. Or
even new concepts, new segments that we could bring in. Because we're willing to try new things. We're a small channel. We started up a couple of years ago. Absolutely, completely agree with you, Adam. We're always looking for ways to improve, and that's the excitement of this project. We're not just sort of stuck between the 2 lines here. We are open to new ideas. So, guys, if there is anything you want, any ideas or any topics of conversations in future podcasts, please share them with us, because we really do appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. As much as I like reading some comments saying this podcast is mid, that's not very helpful. It's funny, but it's not helpful. So please do let us know what your honest opinions of us are, and what you'd like for us to do, what you'd like to see and hear for us in the future. But until then, guys, all of that aside, thank you so much for tuning in. We really loved having you along for this Belgian Grand Prix review. We're going to be back, as always, this week, coming for the Dutch Grand Prix, another F1 race coming your way very soon, with a few special guests, of course, on the way in future episodes. But of course, we'll let you know about that in due course. But until then, please stay safe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care, and thanks for listening.
See you soon.